Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to speak about the event referred to in Jewish tradition as Matan Torah, or the giving of the Torah, of the law at Sinai, which is a major event in the Torah, in the narrative of the 5 books of Moses. And this event is important, is extremely important for 2 reasons. First of all, it contains the covenant. Okay, so the basic foundation of the covenant between God and Israel is presented as occurring at Mount Sinai. So much so that in verses, the Exodus is described as being done, carried out for the purpose of bringing Israel to Sinai, for the purpose of forming the covenant. So Sinai is almost seen as the goal of the Exodus. That's where the marriage, so to speak, between God and Israel is carried out. It's the covenant. And second of all, that is where the mitzvot, the commandments, the laws are given. That is where the 10 commandments, first of all, are given. But also that is where God comes down in a fire, in flames, in a smoke, and speaks to the people and reveals himself. And so all of the people have an experience of the divine human encounter. And they receive not only the 10 commandments from God's mouth, so to speak, but also the other commandments through Moses, who receives these additional commandments from God on Mount Sinai. So this is pivotal. It is so pivotal that we have my first text that I want to read, which is from Deuteronomy 4, says, "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, and don't let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to your children's children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord, your God, at Horeb." Horeb is another name for Sinai. "When God said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my word so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live." I'm skipping a few words. "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain blazed with fire to the very heavens, with black clouds and deep darkness. And the Lord spoke to you out of the fire." This is major dramatic event that must not be forgotten. This is what this text tells us in the name of Moses. Don't forget it. Teach it to your children. Make sure this major pivotal event is always present in your mind, because that's the foundation of everything. What is surprising in light of this text is the fact that when we continue outside of the book of Deuteronomy and go on to the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Tanakh, we find that there is almost no reference to this pivotal event at all. Never mentioned. Always we hear about the Exodus, the Exodus, the Exodus, remember the Exodus, and recalling the Exodus, but never the event at Mount Sinai. And the silence is deafening. So let me just go through some of the texts where one would expect that this event would be alluded to, and yet it is not. And this is number 2, what happened to the Sinai event? So for example, we have in Psalm 78, which is one of the Psalms referring to summarizing the major historical events. And there are a lot of these texts that summarize all the great events. By the way, the most famous one that everyone is familiar with is not found, of this type of text, is not found in the Bible itself. Does anybody know the most famous, most popular Jewish text that summarizes all the great events, God's greatest hits, so to speak? Well, since we can't have too much of a dialogue, I'll answer my own question, and the answer is Dayenu. The Dayenu song is exactly this genre of text, where we say, you know, you could have just have taken us out of Egypt, but no, you did more. You took us out of Egypt and you gave us the manna in the desert. You could have just given us the manna in the desert, but no, you did more, and you did the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And wow, you did all these things. And it goes from one event to the next, to the next, to the next, mentioning and highlighting all the great acts of kindness that God performed for Israel. That whole genre starts in the Bible and continues into rabbinic literature. But here we have a few of these earlier forms of this. For example, he struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, the first fruits of manhood in the tents of Ham. He brought his people out like a flock. He led them like sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely so they were unafraid, but the sea engulfed their enemies. And so he brought them to the border of his holy land, to the hill country his right hand had taken. So notice that we have here the firstborn plague in Egypt, bringing them through the wilderness. The sea engulfs the enemies. That's the story of the splitting of the sea. But then, after that, he brought them to the border of his holy land, and he drove out nations before them. In other words, we have Exodus, traveling through the wilderness, conquest. The most important, perhaps, of elements is what happens in between. And what happens in between is the giving of the Torah. And there's not a mention, not a word. Again, Psalm 136, also pretty well known. It's the psalm that ends with, each line ends with, Ki le'olam chazdo. God did so and so, Ki le'olam chazdo, for his love endures forever. To him who divided the Red Sea asunder, his love endures forever. And he brought Israel through the midst of it. His love endures forever. This is apparently a chorus that, you have here sort of like the leading singer and then the whole choir answering as the leading singer mentions each new element. But swept Pharaoh and his army into the sea, and the chorus adds, for his love endures forever. And he led his people through the wilderness, for his love endures forever. To him who struck down great kings, his love endures forever. And then it goes on to events that happen in the land of Israel. What happened to that major event that nobody's supposed to forget? Be sure, tell it to your children, tell it to your children's children, never forget it. Everybody seems to be forgetting it. And this goes on and on, text after text. I'll just mention one more text because that is the text that I'll spend a little bit more time on. And this is a text in Joshua 24, the last chapter of the book of Joshua. Joshua has just conquered the land, has gathered all the Israelites to a temple at Shechem, today's Nablus. And then Joshua tells the people, gives them this large, long speech, which also summarizes all the great things that God did for the people of Israel. And this, by the way, is also something we read on the Seder night on Pesach. And I'll read just some of Joshua's speech to the people. Joshua said to all the people, I'm reading verse 2, "This is what the Lord God of Israel says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terach, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants." I'm skipping. "Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. When I brought your people out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea, but they cried to the Lord. He put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and he brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the wilderness for a long time. And then I brought you to the land." Notice what the event is that we're told about what happened in the wilderness. The major event that Joshua tells all the people, you lived in the wilderness for a long time. What happened to Sinai? God comes down in fire. He says, gives the 10 commandments. Everybody says we shall do and we shall obey. The covenant is given. The Torah, the mitzvot, not a word. And so as not to belabor the point, because I could repeat many more texts that omit any reference to this great event of Matan Torah that we celebrate on Shavuot. It doesn't appear anywhere in many other texts. And by the way, even the connection between Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot, and the giving of the Torah, that connection is nowhere to be found in the Torah or the Nevi'im or the Ketuvim. In other words, the Bible, when it tells us to celebrate Shavuot, never mentions any explicit connection between that holiday and what we have turned it into, which is a celebration of the giving of the Torah. It's not in the, but the text of the Bible never makes that connection. Until number 3, the first reference to Sinai as an event outside the story in the Pentateuch is in Nehemiah 9. Now, for those who don't remember, and even for those who do, I'll just remind us all that Nehemiah lives in the 5th century BCE, well into the Second Temple period. And we are dealing with a time that is significantly after Jerusalem has been destroyed, Israel has been destroyed, the Israelites went into exile. A few of them have returned to Jerusalem. A small community exists there. And Nehemiah is a Babylonian who comes back to help the Jews in Jerusalem set up shop, so to speak, to help them manage with all the difficulties of living in Israel. And he tries to, encourage them and does a lot of concrete, actual support for the community in Zion, in Israel. And here he does the same thing that everybody else did, which is to summarize all the events, all the great things that God did. And he also goes through the same litany, starting with verse 11. You divided the sea before them, so they passed through it on dry ground. You hurled their pursuers into the depths like a stone in mighty waters. By day you led them with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire. You gave them light on the way they were to take. You came down on Mount Sinai. You spoke to them from heaven. You gave them regulations and laws that are just and right, and decrees and commands that are good. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath and gave them commands, decrees, and laws through your servant Moses. And then it continues. This is the first time that the story of Sinai is integrated into the list of great activities that God has bestowed, has done for his people. And so the question I would like to raise and only begin to answer, because I believe that the answer is very complex, but the question obviously is, why is this so, and what can we learn from this? As I said, I believe that the answer is multifaceted and complex, but I'll try and make a few points that to try and explain this surprising phenomenon. And if there are any questions, we can open the floor, and if not, I'm more than happy to answer through email. So before I get to text number 4, I'd like to just make a few comments. First of all, I believe that this shows, from a historical point of view, at the very least, that the story of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai was not a known component of the national narrative until a very late period. I'm not saying that the story wasn't told, but I am saying that the story did not achieve a central position in the consciousness of the people. It was not, if it was told, it was not known. And it was not accepted. It didn't make it, so to speak. And that is one of the reasons that the book of Deuteronomy is so adamant about saying, don't forget it, don't forget it. Keep tell people this story. This is a great story, it's an important story, tell it. Why is Deuteronomy so insistent? One of the reasons is, I believe, because the story was not on the consciousness or knowledge of most ancient Israelites. People did not know the story, people didn't hear the story, they knew another story. First of all, that the Exodus led directly to the conquest. The main, well-known, dominant story did not have the Sinai component. The main story was that the Exodus had as its goal the land. It did not have as its goal the law. And that only became, that narrative that the goal of the Exodus was the law before the land, was a relatively late development, at least in terms of its dissemination and acceptance. Now, what is the difference between these two conceptions or two narratives? And here I think is a fundamentally important point. The old narrative without Sinai was basically a story about land and independence and nationhood that is founded on national territory. You are, who you are is based on land. It's based on living in your own home. And so the Exodus was meant to create a nation. And how do you create a nation? By taking the people out of slavery and giving them a land in which to build a society. What the specific laws of that society would be can be talked about later. But first and foremost has to be the land. The Sinai narrative comes and says, wait a second, no. Law can't come later. Covenant can't come next. First, one has to have the relationship between God and Israel, the laws, the Torah, the spiritual component. That's what the Exodus is about. It's about creating a spiritual community. After one has that spiritual community, then you can go to the land. But the apex of the Exodus, the point of it all, is to create a holy people. And a holy people is not necessarily a people that are in the land. That holiness can be formed before entering the land and has to be formed before entering the land. That's what makes them holy. Wherever they are, they're holy, regardless of whether they're in the land or not. That is the idea of Sinai. And that idea, I believe, only developed or only became popular and accepted at a relatively late period in Second Temple times, when land and independence and statehood were no longer major elements of Jewish identity.